And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I'm your host, Demo, and this is Commander 2021 spoilers. I say that with a question mark because, man, I just really don't know what's going on anymore. So I guess this is like Ikoria, where they sort of came out with Ikoria and Commander 2020 at the same time, but they called it Ikoria Commander. So when that happened last year, I wasn't really sure. I guess they're doing the same thing here. So this is Commander 2021, or it's Strixhaven Commander. I don't know. Are they coming out with another Commander set this year, or is this the only one? You know, I already did spoilers for some of the legendary creatures, apparently. I did all the ones for the precon. So I guess what they're doing is they're coming out with 5 precons for each school, right? Each of the color combinations, which is a whole lot of Commander content all at once. Like, I don't know why they put these right on top of each other like this, but whatever. I mean, here we go. We got more legendary creatures from those precon decks, I guess. Essex, Fractal, Bloom. 4, a green, and a blue. So a 6 mana 4/4 legendary creature Fractal. So now we have we had a lot of these tokens that were fractals. Now we have an actual creature that is a fractal. It has flying. The first time you would create one or more tokens during each of your turns, you may instead choose a creature other than Essex, Fractal, Bloom, and create that many tokens that are copies of that creature. That's a mouthful. And man, is there ever a lot of mouthfuls? I just want to say, brief reprieve. I look at these cards, the commanders and also some of the cards in the precons, and man, it's just like every single card, it seems like, has a giant paragraph. Anyway, so the first time you would create one or more tokens during each of your turns. So this is only going to trigger on your turn and only once each turn, right? Only once on your turn, that is all. And obviously they did that because it would be way too easy to just go crazy with this and even go infinite with it, right? So you can only do it once on your turn, that is all. And, immediately I think of my Tishana deck again, because it's doing similar things, right? I have Write a Replication in that deck. I have Quasi Duplicate, because what I'm doing is I'm making copies of my ETB creatures. So that's what I first think of with this guy, where I'm like, okay, I can make a token and then I have an Eternal Witness in play, and I can have that token come in as a copy of the Eternal Witness, right? And this is a replacement effect, right? So that token that you would create, instead of being whatever it is, it's going to be a copy of your Eternal Witness or a copy of your whatever. So you can make treasure tokens, you can make any kind of token. Obviously, man, it's a good thing this thing isn't red, because Dockside Extortionist would be bananas in this deck, right? Because you play it, it's going to make 8 treasure tokens, and those 8 treasure tokens could all be copies of your Dockside Extortionist, because it's going to come into play as a copy of a creature. You can copy your opponent's creatures too, but I think more so you're going to want to build your deck around it, right? So yeah, if you could make a teamer version with this deck, get this into play, Dockside Extortionist, make 8 treasure tokens, and then all those treasure tokens become Dockside Extortionists, which then make you, 64 treasure tokens or something. But that's where I would go with this. I would go, lots of ETB creatures. That's what I would probably do. Next up, Dika Fractal Theorist. 5 mana, 4 and a blue. Legendary creature, human wizard, 3/3. Has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. Put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the spell's mana value. And then it has 3 and a blue, target creature token can't be blocked this turn. So for me, as soon as I see this, I'm like, okay, it's another Talron Sky Summoner, right? That's how you probably are going to end up building this deck. Is it worse? Is it better? I don't know. It's definitely the same kind of deck, I think. You just fill your deck with instants and sorceries, and you just play lots of counter spells, very controlling style, and you just sort of slow your opponents down, counter everything they do, and bounce everything they play, and then you just make lots of tokens that you can then attack with. These tokens are going to be bigger. You could cast an Aether Spouts, like your opponent attacks you Aether Spouts and bounce all his stuff to his hand, and then you get a 5/5, right? So that's pretty good. And you can also make your fractal creatures unblockable. So yeah, not too exciting though. Again, I think it's just going to be exactly like a Talron deck for me anyway. Next up, Ruxa, Patient Professor. bear druid, Ruxa. I don't know if anyone else did this, but as soon as I saw Ruxa and a bear, I thought of Teddy Ruxpin. I don't know. Is it just me? Anyway, so he's 2 green. So 4 mana bear druid. He's a 4/4. Whenever Ruxa, patient, Professor enters the battlefield or attacks, return target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. Oh, that's funny. This is a vanilla commander. Wow, that's funny. Creatures you control with no abilities get +1/+1. You may have creatures you control with no ability. Wow, they're really piling it on. With no abilities, assign their combat damage as though they weren't blocked. Wow. So there you have it, right? This is a Grizzly Bears deck, right? You know, obviously you can put cards in there that have abilities, right? If they by the way, an ability is literally anything, okay? First strike, that's an ability. Anything with first strike, trample, any sort of ability isn't going to benefit from Ruxa at all. It has to be a vanilla creature with nothing on it, right? You know, the first card I think of, probably everyone thinks of, Murganda Petroglyphs, creatures with no abilities get +2/+2, right? 4 mana enchantment. That's the card, the only other card in existence that does that kind of ability. So that goes in the deck for sure. So now all of your vanilla creatures get +3/+3. That's pretty damn good. When Ruxa enters the battlefield or attacks, return target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. That's really good. However, you know, it's a really bad creature. So how good is it really? I'm returning a Grizzly Bears from my graveyard to my hand. I mean, obviously, you want sack outlets in this, Evolutionary Leap, stuff like that, because you can just keep sacrificing your creatures and getting them back. I mean, that first ability is really powerful. I mean, what you could do is you could even not make a, you know, vanilla creatures Grizzly Bears deck with this. What you could do is just put a few vanilla creatures in the deck that you could keep reusing with that first ability, sacrifice them, then get them back, sacrifice them, get them back. You don't have to make your whole deck like that, right? You just have to put a few in there that can take advantage of that ability. You could go the I'm just going to make a vanilla creatures with no abilities tribal, but you could also, I think, abuse that first ability without actually building your whole deck around vanilla creatures. Just put a few in there. Next up, Albu, Ancient Witness. 3, a red and a white Boros Commander, legendary artifact creature. So we have another artifact creature commander, and it's a golem. It's a 4/5. Other artifact creatures you control have haste. Okay, so we're doing artifact creature tribal here, obviously. Whenever one or more artifact creatures you control attack, Albu Ancient Witness deals X damage to any target, and you scry X, where X is the number of tapped artifacts you control. Oh, wow. That's a really good ability. I was thinking, how are they going to make artifact creature tribal viable? Because artifact creatures in general aren't great. Also, they're incredibly susceptible, right? Because they're creatures, they die to any, you know, a damnation or any normal board wipe. They also die to a Bane of Progress, right? Someone casts a Bane of Progress, just completely blows you out. Before I even get into what this card does, you're going to need Selfless Spirit. You're going to need Teferi's Protection. You're going to need Boros Charm. Boros Charm is going to be huge with this deck. You know, you're going to need to protect yourself against those Bane of Progress type effects, or you're just going to be screwed. That ability, though, whenever one or more artifact creatures you control attack. So you only need one artifact creature to attack, and your commander is an artifact creature, so you can use your commander for this to trigger this ability. Albu Ancient Witness deals X damage to any target, and you scry X, where X is the number of tapped artifacts you control. So that's your mana rocks. You can just tap your mana rocks, right? This is a really interesting build around. Like, let's say you have 5 artifacts tapped. It deals 5 damage to any target, and you scry 5. That's pretty darn good. I like it. I like scrying, me personally. Like, a card that I think of right off the top of my head is Altar Golem, which is also a golem, so that's significant. 7 mana. It's an artifact creature. It's a golem, obviously, and it has power and toughness, each equal to the number of creatures in play. This is actually a card that has been played in Commander, you know, from time to time, because, you know, there can be a lot of creatures in play. So this guy can be massive, right? He can be a 20/20. And he has trample, and he's going to have haste because of your commander. It doesn't untap during your untap step, but you can tap 5 untapped creatures you control to untap it, which you want to be doing. You want to be tapping your creatures, right? Including your commander, right? Your commander is an artifact, so you want to be tapping your commander so it gets included in that tapped artifact thing. So Altar Golem's fantastic. Comes down, has trample and haste. It's gigantic. You swing with it right away, do a ton of damage. You scry. You deal more damage with Albu's ability. You can tap your creatures to untap it, which you want to be doing anyway. I think that's a great fit. Really interesting build around. You know, there's so many great Boros commanders, and I think I'm only going to pick one to actually do a deck tech on. Might be this one. We'll see. Next up, Veyran. I'm going to go with Veyran. Voice of Duality. 1, a blue, and a red. 3 mana, a free wizard, 2/2. Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, Veyran, Voice of Duality gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So that's not super fantastic. A little Voltron-y, I guess. If you casting or copying an instant... Boy, that's some weird wording, hey? Let me start again here. If you casting or copying an instant or sorcery spell causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So this is Panharmonicon for instants and sorcery spells. Obviously, again, this is just doing Izzet stuff. All of the typical Izzet cards, you know, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, do this or do that. There's tons of cards like that in Izzet. This is going to be a super easy build around. Obviously, Veyran's first ability is also going to trigger twice. So every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it's going to get +2/+2. I mean, obviously you can play all the Magecraft cards from this set in this deck, right? That's going to be an easy inclusion. But there's so many cards in Izzet colors that are already doing the, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it triggers some ability, which is then going to trigger again with your Veyran, right? And you just got to make sure it's a permanent, right? It's whenever a permanent you control triggers. So it has to be, it can't be a spell doing it. Gutter Snipe, obviously, is going to be an auto include in this deck because it's going to trigger twice every time you cast an instant or sorcery spell. Probably going to be, like a win con in a deck like that. Just a really easy build around, I think. I think this deck sort of builds itself. Next up, Lilia, the Blade Reforged. 2 and a red, 2/2 Spirit Warrior with haste. Whenever Lilia, the Blade Reforged, attacks, exile a top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Whenever you exile one or more cards from your library and or your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Lilia. Oh, wow. So, yeah, I love it already. There's a lot of ways you can go with this. First of all, as soon as she attacks, she's going to put a +1/+1 counter on herself, right? Because she's going to exile the top card of your library, right? So she's immediately going to be a 3/3. Exiling cards from your graveyard in red. So, again, I'm thinking as a deck, if you're making an actual mono red deck with this card, obviously it goes in a lot of decks, right? Like right off the top of my head, Belborka. If anyone out there has a Belborka deck, this goes in your Belborka deck. That new commander, Nasari, Dean of Expression, where it also, whenever you cast a spell from exile, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. I think Lilia definitely goes in that deck as well because you're exiling stuff from the top of your library all the time, right? Impulse Draw is going to be fantastic in this deck. Bergie or the horn on the back. I think that I like that horn on the back of Bergie. It's really going to give you basically as much impulse draw as you want. But the exiling cards from your graveyard, that's an interesting one. So I'm thinking Underworld Breach probably would be great in this deck. So yeah, there's definitely some stuff that can go down that road. This really, man, I don't love mono red decks. I have one already. I never thought I would build another one, but this really grabs my attention. I really, really think that I might make a deck with this. I love that when there's two abilities that work together, but aren't the same, right? They're going in different directions. So I can exile stuff from my graveyard with this, or I can do impulse draw. I can go a couple different directions with this because those two abilities they synergize, but they're not exactly the same. I really like cards like that. Next up, Lashiel, Clockwork Scholar, 2 and a white, Elephant Artificer. So already we know it's going to have something to do with artifacts, right? Prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control. Okay, so we have another artifact creature commander. Obviously, this guy goes in the Albu deck, clearly. Whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn, obviously. So, it's kind of funny how they're just trying so hard to give white card draw, and they're just trying to find any way possible. They're like, okay, well, white sort of deals with artifacts, right? So let's do that. I mean, it's interesting. Okay, so it's going to be artifact creature tribal. Whenever an artifact creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So you can definitely just go with tokens here. Because it doesn't say non-token. So you could just, again, put a Thopter token into play and draw a card off of it. And it only triggers once each turn. However, it can do it, again, on other people's turns. It doesn't say only on your turn, right? So you can do it on other people's turns as well. So what you want to do is you want to be putting artifact creatures into play on other people's turns, right? Because because it only triggers only once each turn. On your turn, that's going to be easy. On other people's turn, it's going to be the hard part. The first card that comes to mind for me is Master Trinketeer, 2 and a white dwarf artificer. Servos and Thopters you control get +1/+1. So you could go that route. You could go, like, I probably would imagine you're putting lots of Thopters in this deck anyway. But more importantly, 3 and a white create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. So you can use this to put a servo token onto the battlefield on your opponent's turn, which will then allow you to draw a card, right? So the fact that they didn't limit it to non-token really, opens it up to a lot of different builds. Next up, Octavia, Living Thesis. 8 blue, 10 mana. Wow, that's a lot. Elemental Octopus. So we have I think this is the first Octopus commander. Pretty sure it is. It's an 8/8. This spell costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. Okay. So probably never going to cost this for its full mana cost, right? Ward 8. Wow. So for those who don't know, Ward is your opponents can't target this unless they pay an additional 8 or whatever the ward cost is. So that's basically hexproof, right? It's going to cost you 9 mana to Swords to Plowshares this guy. So can't see that happening very often. So basically this thing has hexproof. Also Magecraft, whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. Whew, boy, that's yeah. So obviously you're going to want to fill your graveyard, lots of looting. Again, I'm focusing on how do you build this as a commander. First of all, obviously there's a lot of decks that this can go in. I mean, first off, that Dika deck, right? Because now you can give your Fractal creature tokens base power and toughness 8/8 on top of the +1/+1 counters they get, and then you can make them unblockable. Yikes. So that definitely goes in that deck. Also goes in your Talron Summoner deck, right? For sure. Probably this is only going to cost you 2 mana. And then whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, one of your 2/2 flyers turns into an 8/8 flyer. That's going to end the game pretty quick. So this card goes in a ton of decks. But just focusing on as a commander, Cephalid Constable comes to mind, right? Turn that Cephalid Constable into an 8/8 and you just ruin someone's day. Like, that's pretty much game over. If you can connect with an 8/8 Cephalid Constable and bounce your opponent's entire board, they're probably just going to say, see ya, I'm out. I mean, yeah, I would just probably a whole lot of looting, right? Frantic search and stuff like that. Fill your graveyard with instants and sorcery spells as fast as possible. But let's give them flashback, right? Because we don't want it to just be a complete waste. We don't want to just fill our graveyard with a bunch of instants and sorcery spells that we can never get back. So maybe put a lot of flashback cards in there so that we can then use them after they're in our graveyard, right? Just more value that way. And once you have the requisite amount of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard, it's just going to cost 2 mana for the rest of the game. Well, 2 mana plus commander tax, right? So that 8 less is going to stay there for the rest of the game. As soon as you get up to 8 in your graveyard, this card's going to cost 8 less for the rest of the game. So that's fantastic. Pretty easy build around, I think. Again, you're going to be in mono blue. It's pretty obvious, lots of instants and sorceries. The counterspell thing, though, doesn't work because you want to cast stuff on your turn, I think, to make your creatures 8/8s so you can attack with them. Casting a counterspell on an opponent's turn. I mean, you're going to put counterspells in this deck, obviously, but doing that, the Talron Summoner or Dika strategy of I can do lots of stuff on my opponent's turn and get value out of it, that doesn't really help you with this deck. So I would go maybe a different route with this deck where you're casting things more on your own turn. And lastly today, Riyonya. Riyonya, Fire Dancer, 3 red, Human Wizard, 3/4. The beginning of combat on your turn. Again, these cards just have so much words on them, right? At the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. They gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. Oh boy. Okay, I'm going to have to read that again. The beginning of combat on your turn. All right, so already at the beginning of combat, that's good because now on my main phase, I can do something that is then going to get affected by this. Also, I like that because I can cast my Riyonya and then immediately get its ability rather than an at the beginning of upkeep ability, which I have to wait a whole nother turn to get. So I really like those at the beginning of combat triggers on a commander. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, create X tokens that are copies of another target creature you control. Wow. Where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells you've cast this turn. Oh boy. Okay, so it's 1 plus, so that means you're getting a 1 no matter what. So if you don't cast anything, you still get 1. You still get to create 1 token that's a copy of another target creature you control. I mean, again, Dockside Extortionist, that's the best card in this deck, right? I have a Dockside Extortionist in play already, and I'm going to create X tokens of it, where X is 1 plus the number of instant and sorcery spells I've cast this turn. So even if I just create 1, and this is every turn, this is every combat, I'm doing this. Every turn I get to create a copy of my Dockside Extortionist. And if I cast a couple of spells, let's say I cast 2 spells on my main phase, now I get 3, right? 1 plus 2, so I get 3 Dockside Extortionist triggers. I mean, they gain haste and you exile them at the beginning of the end step, but who cares? I get all those treasure tokens, right? Man, that's incredible. Definitely an interesting build around, really powerful ability. Again, you're probably going to want to do a lot of ETB type cards. Red isn't great for that. It does have a few. I mean, Flame Tongue Kavu. Hey, there's a card that hasn't been played in a while. I used to have it in my Dragon Lord Atarka deck, which is a deck that's doing those kinds of things. I did take it out for something better, but it would definitely work in this deck, right? When Flame Tongue Kavu enters the battlefield, deals 4 damage to target creature. So making a bunch of copies of that is definitely going to be good. I mean, obviously this card fits in a ton of decks. You could put it in almost any deck, right? Because why wouldn't you want to make copies of creatures that you already have in play, right? I am going to stick this in my Dragon Lord Atarka deck for sure. It's a perfect fit. But if you're building this as a commander, which you definitely could, I think it would make a really interesting deck. The only limiting part here is the amount of really good ETB creatures in mono red. I mean, you are giving your creatures haste and they're attacking, so you could even go, I storm off on my turn. You know, you could go the storm route with this, and I storm off on my turn, cast 5 or 6 spells, and then make 7 copies of my, whatever creature, and I can just kill my, that could be your win con for this deck. Maybe put Bergie in this deck as well for that extra mana, and you could do that just as a win con in this deck. For me, though, I think it's just a really great value commander, and I really like value commanders. So that is it for today. Some Commander 2021 spoilers, 9 new commanders. I mean, we already have 22, I think I counted from Strixhaven, and then a whole bunch more from Commander 2021. We're going to be busy. We're going to be busy on this channel. We're going to be real busy doing deck techs and all sorts of stuff. So get ready for it. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.